I don't believe in charity. I believe in philanthropic investment. Do you know who said that? Well, actually, I did. This was part of our 3-part Dadages series on charity and philanthropy. If you haven't checked out those episodes, I invite you to go back and do so. Today's episode is built on that foundation. Enjoy.
You know, when I was your age, go ask your mother. I know you don't like it. It builds character. How many times do I have to tell you? I'm not just talking to hear my own voice.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Dadages. I'm your host, Chad Hagle. And if you are looking for some fatherly wisdom for your career, your family, or any other aspect of your life, then you've come to the right place. If you want to learn more about Dadages, find additional content, submit questions, or feedback to me, visit dadages.com. Thanks for being here. And before you listen to our podcast, please listen to your father. Philanthropy is obviously a topic that is close to our hearts here at Dadages. We have previously devoted an entire series to philanthropy. At the end of this episode, I'll give you some suggestions of other Dadages episodes you can explore to dive deeper into the topic of philanthropy if it's a subject that interests you. Today, we continue with the discussion of my Dadage, I don't believe in charity, I believe in philanthropic investment. And we have a guest today who is truly an expert on this topic. I'm pleased to welcome to the Dadages virtual studio, Alex Johnston, who is the president and founder of Building Impact Partners, a philanthropy advising practice that has helped to put to work over $1 billion in philanthropic investment since the founding of the organization in 2012. Alex is also the author of a new book, Money with Meaning: How to Create Joy and Impact Through Philanthropy. Alex, welcome to Dadages.
Chad, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this discussion. As I said, philanthropy is a topic that anyone who's been part of the Dadages friends and family for a while now knows it's of great importance to me personally, has been a big part of my life. And I'm really excited about the topic and about the expertise that you bring to the table. And Alex, before we get into the book and our discussion about philanthropy specifically, I'd like to understand a bit more about your background and what led you to a career in philanthropy in the first place. Can you walk us through your story a little bit?
I appreciate that question, Chad. And so many of us who work in the field of philanthropy didn't plan for, or in some cases even prepare for, the work that we do now. It's a little bit like property management or something like that, where it's absolutely a field and there's a body of knowledge you need, but you don't often plan for a career in that area. And for me, I actually, got started. I really think I trace it all the way back to the first 10 years that I had in college and grad school, and then early work in the field of affordable housing. And that was just something I was passionate about. And I ended up as director of operations of a housing authority. And then I had a friend who was starting a school in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was working, and I got a front row seat in what was happening at that school. It was called Amistad Academy, and it grew to be the Achievement First network of charter schools. And I just realized, as great as the work is that we're doing at the Housing Authority, helping communities reclaim their sense of self and really provide affordable housing, I felt like I was still downstream from really helping the country and, in my little way, help us live up to the promises that we make to each other. And so I shifted into the field of education and worked in advocacy for about 7 years. And in that role, I ended up working with a lot of ultra high net worth individuals who were passionate about this topic as well. And I came to realize the difference that people can make with their money, and also how challenging it can be for donors to really know that they're making a difference on the issues they care about. And that made me feel like, hey, you know what? I'm still downstream of where I want to be. And I switched gears about 12, 13 years ago now and started working in the field of philanthropy advising. And over time, with partners, built up this practice, Building Impact Partners.
So you can basically describe your entire career as a salmon swimming back upstream, as you said.
Trying to get to the headwaters, yeah.
That's great. That's great. I appreciate that perspective. And as you said, people, it's not on their radar screen growing up. Oh, I want to be involved in philanthropy. It's not really something that gets promoted as we're going along in our educational career. And there really isn't much of an education available for it. And I think that's why the work you're doing and the book that you wrote and everything are so important, is because there's such a vacuum in that space, and you're really helping to fill that vacuum. Do you see it the same way?
I appreciate that perspective. And yeah, I do think there's a real challenge, which is compounded by the fact that many people who end up in a position to be philanthropic in a really significant way are if you think about the category of ultra high net worth individuals, people with $30 million or more, this is kind of surprising. And I was surprised until I learned this, that 75% of people who have that much money in our society right now didn't start out that way. They made that money in their own lifetime, which means they started out in middle or working class origins. And so lots of people who end up in a position to give in a really significant way financially didn't have a template growing up for doing that. And of course, it's also important that, we can be philanthropic no matter how much money we have. But certainly if you're going to hire a philanthropy advisor, you're probably going to be giving away hundreds of thousands, if not millions a year. And most people who have that much money to give came from a very different circumstance.
Yeah, in a way, it's heartening. It's sort of refreshing to know that the American dream is still alive and well, that you can have repeatedly over and over and over again across a vast cross-section of our population, people achieving that level of financial success within their lifetimes. But it certainly does underscore your point that people are arriving at that point without having had that background and that experience. And that's why it's so valuable for people like you who have devoted their careers to the learning of that world, and then the ability to pay forward and teach what they've learned and be good stewards of those individuals who may not be prepared on their own. It's a very valuable service. Were you exposed at all to philanthropy in the nonprofit sector growing up? What were your formative influences, and how early in your life did it start? Even if you weren't involved in philanthropy, creating within you that spirit and that sense that that was something of value and importance in your life plan.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, for many of us, our first exposure starts within our family or the community that we grew up in. And in my case, I grew up as a member of a church community that, certainly giving was woven into the fabric of that. But I was also a student at a school in Amherst, Massachusetts called the Common School, which is an independent school that actually was founded in the basement of that church that I went to, although it was not a religious school. It was a nonprofit. And that school got by on a shoestring. I was a student there in the 1970s and 1980s, and tuition was, it was enough that you had to sacrifice, but basically families volunteered to clean the grounds, like it was a community effort. And I can remember
what the students were paying wasn't enough to keep the doors open and the lights on for the institution.
And what the teachers were being paid was not that much either. And so they were there also in a spirit of giving. And I can remember fundraisers that were organized by teachers in the school who were musicians. And we had, sort of coffee house concerts, and all the money from the door was given back to the school. And I can remember when I was probably only 9 years old, being given the responsibility of selling tickets at the door, taking the cash box home, counting all the money, and then bringing it back to the school the next day. It was hundreds of dollars. And I just think about from the sort of dad perspective now, I so wish that we lived in a world where that level of responsibility was more easily accessible to our children. And, I think we all as parents have to take accountability for creating those opportunities. But I felt blessed that I grew up in a world where they just abounded. It was sort of organic in the environment that I was in.
Well, I think that's great. And I love to hear that the influences in your life started in that school environment, because I think that's where my philanthropic influence started as well. I went to an Episcopal school growing up, and I understand that gap that exists in private education, that there's really no private educational institution that I've ever been exposed to where the cost of the education is being paid for by tuition. There's a gap that exists. And at any level of education and at any size of institution. And even when you start talking about, my alma mater, Stanford, and everyone talks about, oh, they have an endowment of billions of dollars, it doesn't actually cover the cost of the education. When you add what's coming out of an endowment and what's coming from tuition, there's still a gap at any institution. And a lot of people just don't understand that and don't realize it. I got exposed to it very early in my life, and I'm glad you did as well. And for me, that is part of what has steered me so much into education as the primary vehicle for my own philanthropy. That, in the sense that I believe that the magnifying effect, the multiplicative effect of a gift that is made to an educational institution carries much further than many other types of philanthropy, because of the fact that you're impacting that next generation who then become the next set of philanthropists to support future generations. I've always enjoyed that aspect of philanthropy and the educational environment. And so I'm happy to hear that you and I have some common background in terms of where we were first exposed to the world of philanthropy. And I will come back a little later in the episode to talking about that misconception about educational institutions and large scale institutions and endowments and things like that. Were there, along your career pathway, were there philanthropic leaders that you admired or people that gave you the advice and the guidance and the mentorship in your development that really helped guide your career in the philanthropic space?
Yeah, I think I've had the opportunity to learn from supporting clients and donors. In some cases, working with ultra high net worth individuals or with the institutions that they created to channel their giving. There are a lot of really well-intentioned and committed people who are working in this sector, whether they are the donors themselves or the staff around them. And I think there is a culture of learning by doing in philanthropy that has, lots of positive aspects. But of course, also, I think as the world becomes more complex and wealth becomes more and more concentrated, the stakes get higher and higher. And so, I think actually one of the things that we're doing now at Building Impact Partners is running a training program called Advisors Accelerator, which is really trying to distill what we've learned over the last dozen or so years about working with ultra high net worth folks and how to show up as an advisor that can really be of service to them, not just on their strategy, but also to help them find giving that's really personally meaningful, because I think that's one of the big gaps. And I've been blessed to see when donors land on something that not only is creating impact out in the world, but where they know that it's connected with their values and their own fulfillment. That's the kind of giving that they really lean into. And I think it's so important that we actually acknowledge, it's sort of countercultural in this moment, to be talking about the feelings of ultra high net worth people, because, there's so much concern.
When you get that rich, you don't have feelings anymore.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people who look at this concentration of wealth say, we should tax this, we should regulate this. And I actually don't disagree, just personally, that there are some changes we could consider to our tax structure and to the rules and regulations around donor advised funds, for example. But in the kind of hyper-partisan, gridlocked situation that we're in, we're not about to change policy. And we're also not going to shame people into giving more. We've been running that experiment for quite a while and it's not working. And so actually creating space to acknowledge that the people who are being philanthropic are making choices. And the more compelling and fulfilling those choices are for them, the more giving they're going to do. That's the lens that I think is really important to bring into this conversation.
Yeah, it is possible, if we're not careful, to regulate and tax goodwill out of existence and create a completely socialized state where you're depending upon the benevolence of the government to determine the applicability of resources to support those without. I, as sort of a free market economist, don't necessarily see that as the right pathway toward redistribution of wealth and to having the greatest positive impact, especially when you look at the waste in government spending and how much their bureaucracy dilutes the impact of every dollar that they receive.
Yeah. My perspective is that the extremes don't make sense in either way. And that, we live in a world that's complex enough that we actually have to integrate the best of what works in the public sector, what works in the market, and what works in private life. And that is how we solve complex challenges. And, having worked in a housing authority, there are a lot of things that we need the public sector to do well if it has a responsibility to do it, and it needs resources to do that. And at the same time, I believe there's still a critical role for private philanthropy around innovation and doing things that just wouldn't happen without folks stepping in and helping.
And I like what you said earlier as well about the fact that you're now magnifying your impact, not just by working with and further educating and empowering your clients, but you're educating and empowering the next generation of advisors as well, who will carry your work forward and can expand your work as apostles out there across the world of philanthropy, because there's a lot of people, as you said, who have a capacity to give and are in need of guidance to help make it effective.
Maybe reflecting on my own legacy, I think of the folks that we're working with as my peers, and some of them have deep experience as well. But I think one of the challenges is that as philanthropy advisors, most of the work we do is highly confidential. And so we don't necessarily have the opportunity to learn from each other. And I learn as much from the community that we're working with as they might learn from me. But together, I think we really are figuring out, hey, you know what? If we really reflect on this, there are some frameworks and structures and ways of working that actually seem to help donors lean in even more and find more fulfillment and end up getting more money moving. And, in a world where in the US, the wealthiest 130,000 families, folks with 30 million or more, collectively, they have $15 trillion in wealth, and only 85 billion a year, which is like half of 1%, is actually being given away as philanthropy. And so there's a tremendous opportunity. Many of these folks who hold that level of wealth have the absolute intention, genuine intention to give more. But in many cases, they're struggling to do that in a way that they really believe will make a difference on the things that they care about.
Frustrations and roadblocks abound, for sure. And you said something in your book that relates to this, but on a personal level, that struck me as a really powerful personal message. You said, I know from personal experience that it is no fun to hear a call to make the world a better place and not know how to answer that call with joy as well as impact. I lived 20 years of my life that way before finding a better path. Now, you didn't really expand on those personal experiences in the book, but I'd like to talk more about that. Can you share that part of your story with the friends and family here now? And did these experiences that you're referring to here play into your personal drive to create Building Impact Partners back in 2012?
I have been on a journey of personal development and growth that goes back to, I sort of think about it really, February of 2017 is a date that sticks out. And that's actually when I joined the Entrepreneurs Organization and went to a talk. I was part of the Connecticut chapter back then. And the speaker, asked a room full of entrepreneurs, how many of you have a mission and vision statement for your life? And only one person raised their hand, and it was not me. And this speaker challenged us to really be more intentional. And, I just sort of realized in that moment, but leading up to that for quite a while, that I didn't feel like I was in alignment with my best self. And it's not that someone looking at from the outside would have said, hey, there's a problem here. This was some years after I'd started the business. Things are going well. At that point, I have 3 kids, happily married, but I just had this sense that I wasn't experiencing joy the way that I could, and that I wasn't having as much impact as I could. And so it really kicked off this process of learning and growth. And, I guess it was my version of a midlife crisis. It wasn't a crisis per se, but it was like this instinct to start exploring the world of personal development. And I read hundreds of books, many, many trainings, got certified as a high performance coach and a number of other modalities, and started working with clients in our practice, because it's a little bit like, maybe finding religion or something, where if you are experiencing something that's so meaningful to you, other people see it. And people started asking me like, what's going on? And so it did lead to the book, in the sense that my own healing journey really made me realize, like, wow, it's crazy that I could have gone to this point in my life and only come across all of this wisdom about human flourishing that in some cases has been around for like 2,000 years. Other parts of it are on the cutting edge of, behavioral science, and yet it's convergent. And how is it that we don't have an organized way of teaching each other this, or in some cases, even teaching it to our children? So yeah, that really did lead me to go on that journey myself and then share it with others.
That's great. And I think for many people in the Dadages friends and family, where you've arrived in your journey, they may not really understand what that means. What does a philanthropy advisor actually do? They may not, as I said, people in our friends and family may not realize that helping other people give money away is a really important service.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that certainly growing up, I didn't know was a thing. Philanthropy advising as a field really exists to serve people who have more than they need and who are looking for support in helping connect those resources with impact out in the world, and ideally also a sense of connection and fulfillment for themselves. And I think a lot of times we think, well, that shouldn't be that hard. But many people in their own journey of accumulating wealth start out, like most of us, as what you might call checkbook philanthropists, where they're just writing checks. People ask them, something comes through the mail slot, and they're like, that sounds great. But at a certain point, people get uncomfortable. A lot of people get uncomfortable when the checks start to become $100,000, $1 million checks, and they don't feel like they have any way of really understanding the impact of what they're supporting. That's often when they turn to a philanthropy advisor. And very often the first question we get is like, okay, I've been doing this, myself, but now I feel like I need to get more organized, and I want to really get clear about what I want to support and how I'm going to know that I'm making a difference.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's that self-awareness component. And I keep hearing you come back to talking about joy and talking about impact. And I think it's so valuable for people to understand that in all aspects of life, but especially when you feel like you're doing something good for others, if you're not sensing that joy and that impact, there's definitely something missing. And it's great that you're focused on helping people regain that and realize that in their own experience. And it was about a decade of working and operating, building impact and partners that you decided to write this book. Was there something specific that led you to do that, or said, this is the moment, this is the point in time that I'm ready, or that I'm motivated to do this and take on this undertaking?
Well, I think that the underlying motivation is just the situation where we sit as philanthropy advisors. We sit between ultra high net worth individuals and institutions and amazing social entrepreneurs out in the field doing incredible work across a range of issues. In any given week, I hear from multiple nonprofit leaders who are trying to raise resources and don't have the capital they need to every stage from seed to scale. And then on the other side, we also hear from families that might say, we have $250 million we want to give away, and we're not feeling like connected to what we're doing, and we want to sort of have a better experience. And a lot of times, the folks who are forming that intention to be more philanthropic, it's almost like a project that seems daunting, that they struggle to really get started on. And in a world that is, in some cases, literally on fire, it's hard to sit in the middle of that and feel like there must be more that we as advisors can do. And so the book is really, it's like a DIY guide, for all the folks that we'll never work with, who may never hire an advisor. It's really trying to distill what I've learned about how to help people in that situation, whether you're a philanthropy advisor working with someone like that or a donor yourself, really arrive at the personal intersection for you of impact and joy and fulfillment.
That's great. And I like that you said it was DIY, because I kind of felt like the book is constructed or built as much as it is written. And so let's get into some of the building blocks of the book itself. There's something you said interesting right up front in the intro to the book that I really wanted to explore, because I've felt this a little bit, but I think you've probably experienced it more, and I want to understand it better from your vantage point. You said this book is not a condemnation of philanthropy. A quick tour of the bestseller list shows that this has become a popular sport. Can you help us understand what you're seeing as the backlash against philanthropy? What's out there today, and what's that narrative, and how is it impacting the nonprofit realm?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the challenges that lots of people are seeing is this extraordinary concentration of wealth. In a world where problems feel more and more pressing, every time you look at the data, like from one year to the next, it's almost like there's more and more capital that's pooling at the very top of the wealth distribution.
Yeah, the gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Literally 2 years ago, when I pulled this statistic, there were 100,000 Americans with 30 million or more, what qualifies as ultra high net worth, and they had $11 trillion. Now, 2 years later, it's 130,000 and 15 trillion. And so that's 98 new billionaires joined the Forbes list in 2021 at the height of the pandemic. So there is, I think, this sense that, it's easy to point to that and say, shame on you. How could you sit by? And if you have the ability to engage, what are you possibly thinking? And so there are a bunch of books that frame that question. Anand Giridharadas wrote a book, Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, and sort of pointing that people who go to Davos and talk about systems change are really just self-interested. They're just supporting the system that concentrated their wealth in the first place. And, that argument, it's a bestseller. He's been out there for years, banging away at that. I can make space for some of the arguments that he puts forward in that book. But when I spend time with specific people who are experiencing this journey to wealth in their own lives and trying to figure out and make sense of, I have hundreds of millions of dollars now. What do I do? It may be, countercultural. We may feel like impatient, but the reality is these folks are struggling, and to navigate that journey themselves, to make sense of what it means for them and their kids, and to take action in a world, there's also pretty harsh scrutiny. And so unless you're like a billionaire and already publicly known, many of the people who have this kind of money, they're not household names. There are thousands of them living here in New York City, and nobody really knows who they are. And it's pretty easy for them to stay under the radar. But if they continue to do that, this money will not actually get in flow where it can not only make a difference out in the world, but be deeply fulfilling for the people who put it into flow.
Yeah, I have the vision of what you're describing leading to a lot of money being stuck on the sidelines that could be put to good use in philanthropy. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I think you've talked about this in recent shows as well, where, the industry of wealth management just has been structured in a way where payment based on assets under management, there are reasons why, from a structural or systemic perspective, wealth advisors have a perverse incentive to certainly talk with their clients about giving, but not to really spend down in a dramatic way. And, the reality is that many people are delaying giving, thinking, well, at some point I'll get around to this, or, maybe I want to set up a foundation in perpetuity. And that may make sense for some people, but the needs now are urgent. And there are extraordinary entrepreneurs who, if ultra high net worth individuals knew them and had a relationship with them, they'd be so excited to get behind what they're doing.
It's true, the impact you're talking about. I mean, as you said, all of the people in the food chain of managing wealth are deriving a portion of their consideration and their compensation from AUM, assets under management. It's no one is incentivized to bring that down. And the more money you give away, the more you've reduced that and probably reduced the potential for compensation. Likewise, an individual that is in the high net worth category, we face constraints of every time I go to get a loan for a construction project, I'm forced to abide by certain covenants. Those covenants have net worth guarantees. They have liquidity guarantees. There are structural systems set up out there in my industry, and I'm sure in many other industries as well, that don't allow you to even consider reducing your liquidity or reducing your assets because you'd put yourself on the sidelines and you couldn't actually conduct your business. And so I think that all of the institutions and all of the people, as I said, in this food chain of managing money in any sector, in any industry, are all focused on more, and driving that bar higher and higher. It's where if you don't maintain pushing up against that ultra high net worth level of wealth, you can't conduct business in the same spheres in which you're accustomed to conducting business. You get shut out of the party at that point. And so it's really tough for anyone who's actively conducting business to consider reduction in wealth, net worth, or liquidity.
Yeah. In the book, we talk about 3 wealth stances or relationships you could have with your wealth: aspire and acquire, manage and maintain, and distribute and dispense. And if you are a business owner or you are building something, you're almost always in that aspire and acquire mode, even if you have the intention to be philanthropic for some of the reasons that you outlined, like a line of credit has to be personally secured, and liquidity, depending what industry you're in, can be the entire basis of, like, if you're in real estate, no matter what your net worth is, it's something that you're rolling forward as you go from one project to the next. So
cash is king and cash is scarce.
Yeah. So those are some of the challenges. And I think that another challenge is that people have not defined what is enough. And I think psychologically, there are a lot of elements to that, in a world that gets more and more complex, it might feel scary to almost like try to imagine all the things contingencies that you might try to protect against. And so a lot of people just avoid thinking about that. And they just say, well, I don't know how much is enough, but I'm going to try to build as much as I can. I'm just going to put the pedal to the metal and build up my net worth. And philanthropy is sort of a luxury that I'll get to at some point. And, the result is that, many people drive their net worth to a max, and then their estate is dealing with it. And you talked about this in another show, like one of your guests was saying, like, what a missed opportunity, because, the opportunity you had in your lifetime to make a difference on the issues that you care about. And maybe there's some element of risk that somehow you wouldn't have enough, but certainly for people, above a certain threshold, it is a little bit easier to start saying, wait a minute, there is more here than my family could possibly use or need.
For sure. Definitely the case. And I think one structural change I would love to see from a tax code perspective is and I'm sure many other people fall into this bucket, have amassed a considerable amount of money in my retirement accounts. And there is not an exclusion that I've found, and maybe you found something that makes this possible, where I wouldn't get penalized heavily for taking money out of my IRA, for instance, and directing it toward charitable causes, which I would do. That would be a much easier decision for me than taking money out of circulation that I have for use in my business while I'm straddling that phase 2 and phase 3 of maintaining wealth while distributing wealth at the same time. If I could use money that I can't use for other purposes and the government made that possible, I know I would have more money to flow into the system.
Yeah, and that's an interesting kind of change that, unfortunately, like there are some bills that are hung up in Congress right now having to do with donor advised funds and other things that we just seem unable to look at some common sense solutions and act on them.
Yeah, yeah. And you talked about common sense solutions, and we've talked about some common problems, but can you highlight a few more of sort of the common challenges that you see for people face when it comes to giving?
Yeah, well, I think this issue of understanding what is enough is a big one. But very connected to that is conversation within your family. Because again, if you are a wealth creator and, like 75% of ultra high net worth folks, you started off working your middle class, you probably in your, own childhood experience had you were taught, we don't talk about money. It's not polite. And so that makes you reluctant to talk about money with your kids. Maybe you do with your spouse, but you're probably not talking about money as much as is now merited based on the change in your circumstances, because managing your wealth, figuring out what it means for you and your family actually requires some engagement. And, I've talked to many people who are really worried that talking to if their kids understood just how much they had, it would mess them up. It would, change their values. And this is also why wealth doesn't sustain, ultra wealth doesn't sustain across generations, as much as you might think, because people don't actually figure out how to manage and maintain that wealth. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think dynamism is good. We don't necessarily want dynastic wealth in a democratic country or anywhere, in my view. But still, that friction within the family is around conversations about wealth is a huge barrier to more meaningful giving.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've certainly witnessed it firsthand. If there is discussion about wealth and about money, most of that discussion is limited to the very first component, which is wealth creation, making money. Very little, maybe preservation, but very little is focused on management and then what to do with the money and how to distribute it and what the future looks like. Yeah, I think that's where the families with wealth probably face some short-sightedness when it comes to the topics for discussion. I want to come back and look at sort of your holistic view of giving, because I really like it. And we've already highlighted joy and impact. And you say in the book, there are 4 key things you need to focus on to gear up your giving in a way that creates impact, joy, and meaning for you in the world at large. Philanthropy at its best is about getting visionary, getting real, getting together, and getting better. Can you elaborate on these important points, these 4 components related to maximizing the experience and the impact of giving? And that's where we will pause for today, friends and family. Please join us for our next episode of Dadages, and we will resume from this spot and get some great insights from Alex. We'll learn some more about the interplay between giving and self-interest, and Alex will give me some great guidance in a host help segment here on Dadages. Until next time, remember, Dad may not always know what he's talking about, but he sure can sound like he does.